Welcome to Research Methods in the second week and the second lecture. As you know, we got rained out, so I'm going to quickly go through the lecture that we would have had today. If you go to Modules and then you go to the second week, and you go to Lecture 4, More Science, and open that up, you'll get more on belief and science, and that is the lecture we're talking about today. If I actually make the PowerPoint run the way it's supposed to, it turns off my recording device, so it will shut me down. So I'm going to leave it looking like this. Now, last week, you were assigned to read a couple of articles. One of them was called The Importance of Studying the Obvious by Duncan Watts. And he talked about how social science often gets bashed by Congress for funding, whereas biological science, physics don't. And he thinks that the reason for that is A, social science studies have sillier sounding titles. B, the critics come from states with few social scientists. B, the studies show politicians in an unfavorable light. Or D, we all have experiences directly relevant to social science. The answer, of course, is D, because we're studying the obvious. And what he says is, people say, well, this is all just common sense. And the problem with that argument is that, well, common sense can lead you to opposite conclusions. So people are sometimes surprised when the study comes out exactly the opposite to what they thought based on common sense. And instead of changing their mind, oftentimes they dismiss the study because it doesn't conform to common sense. And we talked about why, some of the reasons why that might be in terms of faulty perceptions and memory and so forth in the last lecture. And the other review question, in evaluating personal experience, Robert Todd Carroll describes a man named Mike who suffered from food allergies, visited a woman who practiced applied kinesiology, and C, was cured. Carroll's primary objection to Mike's belief that applied kinesiology provided the cure was A, Mike's memory of what happened is faulty, B, the AK tests contradicted conventional medical tests of food allergy, C, the woman had no license to practice medicine, or D, there was no comparison to see whether he would have improved without treatment. So Mike is pretty sure that that's the thing that cured him, but there's no comparison group. So if we want to know whether a treatment is effective, we need to compare people who got the treatment with people who didn't and see what the outcomes are in comparison. Personal experience is confounded. There are always multiple things going on for each of us. So we assume that we know why things happen, but we can't really test them. And that's why we have research. All right. So the clicker points for this lecture obviously don't count because we're not there to do the clickers, but we're just going to prorate the points. So the percentage of points and for clickers is what matters, not the absolute number. So you're not losing anything by not being able to do this in class. I think that's what I want to tell you about clickers. Oh, yeah, and still, these going through these kinds of questions helps your recall, because it's that challenging yourself business, and it helps you on exams when you get tested on similar kinds of things, or it should help you with exams. So the next bit we want to talk about is the research versus your intuition. So what Morling says is we have problems because of thinking the way we want. So we're motivated to believe certain things, and we try to live our lives so that we get our beliefs confirmed rather than disconfirmed. And then what she calls thinking the easy way, which means we are set up to do things with the least effort possible. It's not that we're really necessarily lazy by design, but call us efficient, if you will. We want to get the most mileage for the least gas. That's the way we're set up. Okay, so let's take them in turn. Thinking the way we want. She talks about 3 different kinds of things. One is being overconfident. So, we have ideas or beliefs, and sometimes we're pretty sure that they're right. I remember my first year of college. We had to read some books and then get together and talk about the books, and people would have really strong opinions about things, and you kind of expected at some point, someone would say something, then you'd expect them to say, "Well, did you actually read the book?" And then the person would say, "No, but I know." um, so people tend to be very confident in their opinions about things. Well, uh, as a consequence of that, one of the things we do is so-called cherry picking the evidence. So we tend to seek and accept the evidence that supports what we already think. That's why some of us watch MSNBC and some of us watch Fox for our news. So we have different political viewpoints, and we tend to get the news that we want from the entity that we want, that has the slant that we want. Same thing with our newspapers. I don't know about you, but my Facebook feed, most of the people think the way I do. There are a few who don't and share their views, but most of us, by and large, have friends who think more or less the same way we do about things, and so we tend to get and look for the kind of evidence that's consistent with our beliefs and values. Another thing she talks about is asking biased questions. So we ask questions that are likely to give us the desired answer. So in a job employment interview, if a person thinks that you are lazy, then they'll ask a lot of questions to try and get you to admit how lazy you are. So in this example, she says the therapist suspects her client has an anxiety disorder. What kind of questions should she be asking that would both potentially confirm and potentially disconfirm her hypothesis? So if she's thinking this, our natural tendency would be, well, what kind of situations make you anxious, and what kind of response do you have when you're anxious, and does the anxiety get in the way of you doing things that you want to do, and questions like that. It's harder to think now, what kind of stuff would indicate you don't have an anxiety disorder? So what kinds of activities make you feel calm? And can you give me examples where you've been nervous about things, but you managed to get them done anyhow, or you were frightened and you overcame your fear? So you'd have to try to look at it both ways to get the data out there and try to summarize all of it. So I think that sort of cherry picking and asking biased questions are very common sorts of things that we all do, whether we think about it or not. All right, so that's the thinking the way we want. Thinking the easy way, she talks about 3 kinds of things. One is the good story. So we accept a conclusion just because it makes sense. So people tell a story, this happened, and this happened, and this happened, and finally that happened because of A, B, and C. We just get carried along by the stream of things. There are a couple that are more sort of psychological, I guess you could say, the present-present bias and the pop-up principle. Let's look at those. Okay, in present-present bias, we're focusing on positive instances. So we're looking at 2 different variables, and we're noticing when both of them occur. So we focus on the, quote, hits, unquote, the memorable co-occurrences rather than the, quote, misses, unquote, the absence of memorable co-occurrences. So, for example, lots of people believe that when the moon is full, people have psychiatric breakdowns. Uh, so, people remember and talk about instances where there was a full moon and someone went, as they say, loony. And that is easy to remember. So that's present, present. So the moon is full, the person is psychiatric, has a breakdown. But it's harder to remember when the moon is not full and people are having these breakdowns. So those are the misses, because the moon not being full is not so memorable as the moon being full. And uh, what about when there's no full moon and there's no uh, admissions to hospital? That people don't get admitted. So, in order to find an association, we need to have uh, psychiatric breaks and psychiatric normal, and we need to have full moon and not full moon. You have to have both those things to see if there is an association. Well, present present has to do with us focusing on this part. And, we get an idea and we see instances of it, and then we remember that and we tell other people about it. So that's the present present bias. Another example, does expressing frustration lead to feeling better? So it's relatively easy to remember times where you were frustrated, it made you angry, it did something, and made you feel better. So that's called a hit. If you expressed your frustration and then felt better. If you did nothing and then felt better, well, then that would be a miss. And if you expressed your frustration and felt worse, well, oops, that's backward. And if you did nothing and felt worse, well, that's the last piece of information you need. So what happens is, in this present-present bias business, we think there's an association between the two because remember the two things going together. We remember we expressed our frustration and then we felt better. So we figure those two things are associated, even though they may not be, or it might be actually the other way around. Remember, I showed you that study about the expressing frustration versus sitting quietly and meditating, and the meditation actually led to less subsequent expression of hostility. So when two events coincide, that confirms our initial expectation. So we notice it, we remember it, tell other people about it, we assume there's an association there when maybe there is, maybe there isn't. So do red lights happen more often when you're late? And probably, if you're like me, you think they do. And I gotta ask you, does the light know that you're late? and specifically try to frustrate you? Well, you might think so too, but no, red light doesn't actually know whether you're late or not. We just notice the red lights when we're late, and so it seems like they're more often or more common or more frequent. There's an association between being tardy and hitting the red lights. So that's all present-present bias. Pop-up principle is things that come to mind easily guide our thinking. So when we're thinking about how common or how frequent something is, what we do is we rely on this heuristic of, well, how hard is it to think about? If it's easily coming to mind, then we think it's common or frequent or usual. So for example, if you see a number of reports about car thefts on the news, you decide that car theft is pretty common, and maybe a lot more common than it really is. Or you watched Shark Week and you saw shark attacks, and you start to think that the shark attacks are common, and then you go to the beach and you decide, I'm not going in there because probably I'll get bit by a shark if I go wading in the water. Or if you read about lottery winners, you start to overestimate your own likelihood of winning the jackpot, and you start spending a lot of money on lottery tickets. Okay, so in each of these cases, the idea is whatever comes to mind easily is the likely thing. is frequently happening. So if you were to travel to France for a 2-week vacation, what do you think is the most likely to cause you death or serious injury while you're there? Not that you are going to be injured or die if you go to France. I'm not suggesting that. I'm just saying, now think about this for a second. You imagine that you got in the plane, you get to France, you're in Paris, you got 2 weeks. What's most likely going to be a problem for you? It's going to wind you up in the hospital or in the morgue, right? Well, probably the first thing that comes to your mind is terrorist attacks. Maybe not. Maybe it's something else. Maybe it's drinking too much French wine. I don't know. Um, uh, Probably the most likely cause of death is traffic. So you're likely to be hit by a bus or a car or something like that, especially if you're in your 20s. You're not likely to die from diseases. You're likely to die from being clobbered by a car or a motorcycle or something. Okay? And when, all right, now you survived, but the point is, the thing that occurs to you is this wacky stuff that you see splashed on the news. I mean, how many people die in France every day? Well, lots of them. But you don't see that in the news, right? You just see when there's a terrorist attack, you see a lot about it. And you start to think, okay, well, that must be common. So you made it home safely from France, and now, now the morbid question is, are you more likely to die by falling down or by fire? And probably you think you're more likely to die by fire. Most people do, because that's the thing you see in the news. You see fires in the news. You don't see much in the news about people falling down and dying. But actually, that's you're more likely to die by falling down than you are by burning to death. Especially if you're old. Old people fall down, they hit their head, and that's the end of us. All right, so what's the difference? How do I tell the difference between this positive and this pop-up? Well, positive, there's two variables going on here. So you need a 2x2 table to assess the accuracy of an association. And the mistake in the positive thing is the association or causal connection between the two variables. So full moon triggers psychiatric admission. So you got the two things that are going on. You got the full moon or not, and you got psychiatric admissions or not. So is there association between two different things? So my story about toothpaste in my grandmother's teeth falling out. Right? So the toothpaste caused the teeth to fall out. So there's that association there because those are the two memorable things. Pop-up for availability has to do with ease of recall. And, I should say that oftentimes things that we see to go together are associated. That's positive. Oftentimes we're right about this. And oftentimes availability or pop-up is a pretty good indication. So oftentimes we are right. The things that we remember more easily are the more frequent things. It's just sometimes we have a biased sample because of things that are memorable or the kind of information that comes to us. So pop-up or availability is based on ease of recall. So the mistake is about frequency or intensity of occurrence. So how often do things happen? So for example, that death by fire versus death by falling. So you're talking about the relative frequency. It's not, not two different variables. It's how often does it happen? Or not two variables being associated. It's a question of how often things happen. So what's more common, murder by strangers or murder by family members? Well, you might think murder by strangers because that's what gets the news, but most people who murder each other know each other. Sadly enough, family members are the ones that are most likely to kill you. So be careful about picking your family. Are there more words that begin with T or have T as a third letter? So the idea is it's easier to think of words that begin with T, so you probably think there's more of them. And actually, I'm not sure what the truth of that particular last one is, but you get the idea. The availability or pop-up principle is that we tend to think things are common that are easily brought to mind. Okay, comprehension question. The most common second language spoken by people in all the southern states in the U.S. is Spanish. Okay, so is this, what applies here? Cherry picking, pop-up principle, present, or reasoning by authority. Well, here we're talking about the frequency, and probably when you think about uh, what's a common language, you think about, well, who can I think of? Who do I know? And certainly in Tampa, Spanish is the thing that's going to come to mind. And so it would be this, pop-up principle for availability because it's easy to remember. If you lived in New Orleans, you might think differently because you would know lots of people who speak French, and you'd figure French was the right answer. Okay, so Larry had a horrible Friday the 13th. First, his car wouldn't start. Then his girlfriend told him she needed a little more space. Finally, his dog ate a bunch of Hershey's Kisses, threw up, and had to be taken to the vet. Larry believes Friday the 13th means bad luck. So what do we got here? Cherry picking, pop-up, availability, present, or reasoning by authority. Well, this would be present because Friday the 13th is the cause of all the bad luck because he's noticed that it's Friday the 13th and he's noticed all this stuff happened. This bad stuff happened. I hope his Saturday turns out to be better than Friday.